Chapter 21, Save, Save, Save. Following the victory, Ulrichsen gave the boys 2 weeks off. When they returned to the Shell House on May 4th, they rowed raggedly from the first few days back on the water until they found their swing again. But find it they did. They promptly began to power past the other shells. On or off the water, they were almost always together now. They ate together, studied together, and played together. On weekend evenings, they gathered around the old upright piano in the parlor of the Varsity Boat Club and sang for hours. Don Hume tore through jazz tunes, show tunes, blues, and ragtime. Sometimes Roger Morris played saxophone and Johnny White played along on his violin. And almost always, Joe got out his banjo or his guitar and joined in as well. Nobody laughed at him anymore. Nobody dreamed of laughing at him. By the end of May, the boys were again turning in phenomenal times on the water. But their success in Seattle didn't guarantee victory in Poughkeepsie. The regatta on the Hudson would be a 4-mile race, not 3, and the California boys had proven time and again that they were masters at the longer distance. On June 6th, Ulrichsen took the varsity and JV out for a final 4-mile trial before leaving in Poughkeepsie. He told Bobby Mock to hold the varsity back behind the JV boat for the first 2 miles, but as they moved down the lake, rowing at a leisurely stroke rate of 26, the varsity could not manage to stay behind. They kept edging out in front simply on the power of their long, slow strokes. When Mock finally turned them loose in the final mile, they exploded into a 7-length lead, and they were still pulling away as they crossed the finish line. 4 days later, the boys arrived at Seattle's railroad station, led by a police escort with sirens wailing and red lights flashing. In the station, the marching band was already playing fight songs. The crowd packed with cheering leaders, journalists, parents, cousins, next-door neighbors, and utter strangers. The boys had not just packed for New York, they had packed as if they had already made the Olympics and were heading for Berlin. Some of them were even making plans to tour Europe after the games, although none of them were sure where they'd get the money for that. Johnny White had a grand total of $14 in his pocket. Bobby Mock was hoping to visit his relatives in Switzerland and Alsace or Lorraine. At last, his father Gaston hesitated to give his son their addresses, but he agreed to send them a letter if the crew really went to Europe. The boys climbed aboard, and as the strain coughed, lurched, and began to pull away, they hung from the windows shouting farewells. "Goodbye, Mom. I'll write from Berlin." Joe hung out a window as well, searching. Then in the far corner, he found her. Joyce was standing with his father, and the kids jumping up and down, holding a sign over her head. In the middle of the sign, she had painted a large 4-leaf clover. The Washington boys arrived in Poughkeepsie early in the morning on June 14th, in the midst of a summer thunderstorm. They were not using a rickety old shack for a boathouse this year. They moved into Cornell's former boathouse right next to California's. The new quarters had been provided by the regatta authorities as a result of Washington's newfound respect in the East. It had hot showers, exercise facilities, electricity, and extra long beds. And the roof didn't leak. By the time they had finished settling in, they could smell food cooking, led by their nose and by Joe Rance's nose in particular. They quickly discovered the best feature of the new place. There was a cookhouse on the beach, just 25 feet from their front door. An African-American woman named Evanda May Colomier was in charge, and she was an awe-inspiring cook. The boys had heaps of fried chicken for lunch, and they were in heaven. Nobody appreciated it more than Joe, who went back for seconds and thirds. Seattle's Post-Intelligencer newspaper published a story on their first meal, with a picture of Joe captioned, "Joe Rance, the eating champion." Pocock visited the California boathouse to check on the shell he'd built then, but the Washington boys declined to speak to their rivals. On the dock they shared, the two crews passed each other silently, with eyes averted like dogs circling before a fight, and although a fight on land was possible, a battle on the water was near certainty. During the next few days, word leaked out that Cal had turned in a blazing time of 19 minutes and 31 seconds over 4 miles. After Washington held its own time trial, Ulrichsen announced that there was their time was slower, a fraction of a second over 19 minutes and 39 seconds. But Ulrichsen may have been trying to deceive Kai Ebright. Johnny White recorded the boys in true time in his journal that night, 19 minutes and 25 seconds. The next day, though, rumors began to circulate that California had held yet another time trial and turned in a phenomenal time of 18 minutes and 46 seconds. But Ulrichsen remained unruffled. He was not going to schedule another trial. He wanted well-rested boys in the race. He told his boys to relax. There would be only light workouts until the race day, and that was fine with the boys. They already knew something that nobody else knew, not even their coach. Late on the night of their final time trial, after the wind had died down and the waters had calmed, they had begun to row back up the river in the dark side by side with freshman and JV boats. It was a moonless night. The water was ink black. Bobby Mock set the boys rowing at a leisurely 22 or 23. Joe and his crewmates chatted softly with the boys in other two boats. But they soon found that they had pulled ahead without meaning to, just rowing soft and steady. Soon, in fact, they pulled so far ahead that they could not even hear the boys talking in the other boats. And then, one by one, they realized they couldn't hear anything at all except for the gentle murmur of their blades dipping into and out of the water. They were rowing in utter darkness now. They were alone together in a realm of silence and darkness. They were rowing perfectly, fluidly, mindlessly. They were rowing in perfect unity as if on another plane amongst the stars, just as Pocock had said, and it was beautiful. By the morning of the championship regatta, the consensus in the eastern newspapers was that California and Cornell were the boats to beat in the varsity race. People crowded onto ferries, boats, and the observation train. As many as 90,000 fans lined both sides of the Hudson River. As the starting time approached, the breeze died. The water was placid, smooth, and glassy, tinged with bronze in the late afternoon light. The freshman came through again for Tom Boles. He was wearing his lucky fedora, but he didn't need it, as his boys gradually overpowered Navy, then beat Cal by a boat length. An hour later, Washington's JV crossed the line 3 lengths ahead of the Navy, still pulling away at the head of a long, strung-out parade of boats far into their rear. Even as the last boats crossed the line and the cheering began to die down, a murmur began to ripple through the crowd along the shore. Washington, for a second time in 2 years, now stood again on the brink of sweeping regatta. California, on the other hand, could become only the second school ever to win the varsity race 4 years in a row. But anything was possible. Cornell looked as if he could finally win this year. Or maybe Navy. As the observation train drew back upriver again for the start, the atmosphere grew electric. The crowd began to buzz. The boat whistles shrilled. Fans draped arms over one another's shoulders and sang college fight songs. On the train, in a car packed full of Washington coaches, alumni, and sports writers, George Pocock and Tom Boles paced up and down the aisles. Al Ulrichsen sat alone in silence, looking out from under the brim of his white cloth cap toward the spot where Joe and the boys sat in their shell, waiting. Washington had drawn the worst lane, number 7, far out in the middle of the river, where any hint of wind or current would be strongest. California had drawn the most protected lane, number 1. At 8 p.m., the starter called out, "Are you ready?" The starting gun popped, and 4-5 full strokes, all 7 boats stayed even. Then Washington suddenly eased up. The other boats surged out in front of them. That was okay with Bobby Mock. That was just what he wanted. Prior to the race, Ulrichsen had explained that he had a new plan for his coxswain to follow. He wanted the boys to stay at a low, easy stroke rate no matter what the boats were doing. If they fell more than 2 boat lengths behind, he told Mock he shouldn't pick up the pace, but otherwise he wanted them to hold off until the halfway point, then start to raise the rate and pass the leaders at the end. Now, as Mock settled his crew in, rowing at a steady 28, he began to chant their newest rowing mantra in time with the stroke. "Save, save, save," reminding them to conserve their power. After a mile and a half, Washington was in last place, almost 5 lengths behind the leaders. A mile into the race, Navy and Penn were in the lead, and California and Columbia close behind. as Washington passed Syracuse but remained 4 lengths back. On the train, Al Albrechtsen was still silent and calm, slowly chewing a stick of gum. Soon he figured Bobby Mock would make his move, just as they planned. At 2 miles, Penn had begun to fade, falling behind Columbia. Cal and Navy were battling for the lead. Washington was in 5th place, but Bobby Mock still hadn't altered the beat at all. Albrechtsen began to grow uneasy. He had told Mock not to let the leaders get more than 2 lengths ahead. Now the boys were twice that far behind, and Mock was supposed to have started moving by now. But out on the water, Bobby Mock told Don Hume, "Take your time. We can catch those boys up anytime we want." As they passed the 2.5-mile mark, Albrechtsen had began to slump in his seat. He stopped chewing his gum. What on earth was Mock doing? Why in God's name didn't he turn them loose? Tom Bowles and George Pocock sat down looking morose. It was starting to look like a case of suicide. In the boat, Bobby Mock took a long look at 4 lengths between his bows and California's stern and hollered to the boys facing him, "Okay, you lugs, we're 1 length behind." A roar went up as the crowds near the finish line began to see the leaders. Navy was neck and neck with Cal, and 2 of them seemed to be running away with it. With a mile to go, Washington was still nearby 3 lengths back. The boys were rowing as if in the kind of trance now. There was little sound out of the middle of the river except for Mock's chanting, the rattle of the oars in the locks, their own deep rhythmic breathing, and their pulses pounding in their ears. There was almost no pain. In the number 5 seat, Stub McMillan realized with astonishment that he was still breathing easy. Through his nose on the train, Albrechtsen muttered, "They're overplaying their hand. We'll be lucky to finish 3rd. His face had gone white. Then suddenly Bobby Mock leaned into Don Hume's face and bellowed, "Give me 10 hard ones for Albrechtsen." 8 long spruce oars bowed in water 10 times. Then Mock bellowed again, "Give me 10 more for Pocock." Another 10 enormous strokes. Then another lie. "Here's California. We're on them. 10 more big ones for Mom and Dad." Very slowly, the Husky Clippers slipped past Columbia and began to creep up on Navy in a second. On the train, someone called out, "Look at Washington! Look at Washington! Here comes Washington!" All eyes shifted from the leaders to the 8 white blades barely was visible out of the middle of the river. Another roar rose from the crowd. It seemed impossible for Washington to close the gap. They were half a mile from the finish and 2 lengths still back. In the boat, Mock barked, "Okay, now." Don Hume took the stroke up to 35, then to 36, then to 37. On the starboard, Joe Rance fell in behind him, just as smooth as silk. The boat began to start to swing. The bow began to rise out of the water. Washington slid past the Navy oarsmen as if their shell was pinned to the water. Cal Coxswain glanced over his shoulder. For the first time since he'd left it behind at the starting line, he saw a Washington boat sweeping up from behind him. He bellowed at his crew to pick it up. Mock hollered at Hume to take the Washington rate up another notch. The 2 boats careened into the last 500 yards, storming down the corridor of an open water between the spectators' boats. With the finish line looming ahead, Bobby Mock screamed something nobody could understand. Johnny White in the number 4 seat suddenly had a sensation that they were flying. Shorty Hunt had still seen the California boat fall into his field view. He kept his eyes locked on the back of Joe Rance's neck and pulled with his whole heart. Joe had boiled everything down to one action, one continuous movement, one thought. The crew's old mantra was running through his mind like a river, not in his own voice, but in George Pocock's crisp English accent. "M.I.B., M.I.B., M.I.B." On the train, Al Albrechtsen stared silently at the scene unfolding in front of him. A Seattle sports writer began to holler, "Come on, Washington, come on." Another writer shoved his paper press badge into his mouth and began to devour it. Tom Bowles was jumping up and down, beating the fellow in front of him with his lucky old fedora. Then, in the last 200 yards, Payne suddenly came shrieking back into the boat, steering the boys' legs, their arms, their shoulders, tearing at their hearts, lungs as they desperately gulped at air. And in those last 200 yards, it was an extraordinary burst of speed. Washington passed California with each stroke. The boys took their rivals down by the length of another seat. By the time the 2 boats crossed the line, A glimmer of open water showed between the bow of Cal's boat and the stern of the Husky Clipper. Watching from the train, Ulbrichtsen resumed chewing his gum. George Pocock threw back his head and howled. The sports writer removed the chewed-up remains of the press from his mouth. Tom Bowles continued beating the man in front of him with his lucky fedora, and in the boat the boys pumped their fists in the dark night air. When the reporters approached Ulbrichtsen, he stood up and said simply, "Well, they made it close, but they won." Then he added, "I guess that little runt knew what he was doing." Later when they got back to the shell house, the boys found hundreds of excited fans waiting for them. They climbed out of the Husky Clipper and, following another rowing tradition, threw coxswain Bobby Mock into the Hudson to the delight of the spectators. After retrieving him from the water, they forced their way through the crowd into the building. Ulbrichtsen climbed onto a bench. The boys, clutching jerseys they'd collected from the losing crews, sat on the floor around him. After a few remarks to all the rowers proclaiming that every son and daughter of Washington was proud of them, he addressed the varsity. Never in history has a crew given a more gallant game fight to win the most coveted rowing honor at stake in this country than a varsity did today. And I can only say to you that I am proud and happy." He paused and looked at around the room and then concluded, "I never expect to see a better road raced. Then he stepped down. Nobody cheered. Nobody stood up and applauded. Everyone just sat silently, soaking in the moment. On the stormy night in January 1935, when Ulbrichtsen had first started talking openly about going to the Olympics, everyone had stood and cheered. But then it had seemed like a dream. Now they were on the verge of actually making it happen. Cheering somehow seemed dangerous.